I've done a lot of videos on the ZX Spectrum over the years, but while I've mentioned it here and there, the videos I've done are mostly about things from the past. I've perhaps not mentioned what's happening on the Spectrum right now enough, because that's a thing that might surprise people who are less familiar with the incredibly old and seemingly quite antiquated platform that I cover. The one with the colours that all clash with each other, that doesn't do scrolling particularly well, and has the odd bit of single channel beeper music. The ZX Spectrum gaming scene in 2021 is actually one of the most vibrant around. Now, of course, a lot of old platforms still have people making games for them, and oftentimes this sort of thing is called homebrew. It can be seen as quite a hobbyist thing. Yet the ZX Spectrum does blur the lines a little bit. It is, after all, perfectly possible to make games that may use a lot of the same techniques and software that we used to make them 3 decades ago, and from a technical point are exactly as good, if not often way better, than the standard of games released back in the system's commercial heyday. This is true of a whole bunch of the old micros in fact. The C64 and the Amstrad are also very healthy here. Indeed, you could almost argue that making a big list of the best games on these platforms might be incomplete if you didn't at least consider some of the best titles from recent years as opposed to purely concentrating on the classics. Just look at Pinball Dreams on the Amstrad CPC, for example. That might be the single best computer game ever released for the platform. You could make a very strong case for it, certainly. And speaking of commercial, well, it's not like you can't sell these games, so long as they're original products. People most certainly still do sell specky games, and people do buy them. There's plenty of good channels dedicated entirely to new Spectrum games, with decent followings, and it's not just an English thing either. Indeed, so many of the titles that have come out from Eastern Europe since the 1990s up to the present day have been astounding, and in 2021, especially with the advent of the Spectrum Next and what we're going to see as people get further and further into using it, and more games made with the next start arriving, it's only going to get better. And there's always going to be lots to come in the classic 1 to 8K and even 48K arenas as well. From both relative newbies to vets who have been using the Specky for well over 30 years now. Said people may even include the most famous names from the Spectrum salad days. Which, in a roundabout way, brings us to today's topic, one of the most hyped new Specky games currently out there. Not exactly a shock that, considering that it's a new Dizzy game that has been designed by the creators themselves, Andrew and Philip, the Oliver twins. Wonderful Dizzy has been out for a good couple of weeks now, and it's attracted not just the attention of the heads who are well into the Specky scene already, but more casual folk who are curious to see a new Dizzy game after all of this time. And helpfully, the bar for entry is very low. Wonderful Dizzy costs absolutely nothing, and all you need to play it is a ZX Spectrum emulator. In fact, you don't even need that on your computer. You can just go to yokefolk.com and play the game online without having to download anything at all. Brilliant, eh? I don't even need to weigh things up and tell you if the game's worth buying, because it doesn't cost you a penny. My work here's done. But of course it isn't. I mean, that would just be silly. The new Dizzy deserves more time than that to see just how good an entry it is into this gloriously eggy canon. It's been a years-long labour of love after all. Announced during the first Kickstarter for the ZX Spectrum Next, the new Dizzy's taken a long journey featuring not just the Oliver twins and the generally traditional methods they've used to design the game, but the brilliant people from the scene who've taken that design and made it a reality. By and large, these folk were responsible for the fantastic Crystal Kingdom Dizzy 2017, a remake and reimagining of one of the more maligned entries in the Dizzy series. Programmer of Jenny Barsky, artists Dmitry Ponomazhov, Gerald Bentley, Oleg Origin, Alexander Filyanov, and Marco Antonio Del Campo, alongside musician Sergei Kosov, represent the new blood, the people who are doing excellent stuff on the Specky right now. Old and new? East meets West? Forget about such cliches like that. What you've got here is a team of Specky superstars, no matter how you slice it. Or crack it, I suppose. Because, in case you forgot, Dizzy is an egg. I've played through Wonderful Dizzy a good couple of times now and have managed to get the game pretty well down into my bones, so I've got plenty of thoughts here. I do have the Olivers themselves to thank. They did invite myself and several other folk to give the game a jolly good testing to in the weeks before final release to see how the game played and if there was anything that needed fixing. I suppose you want to know already whether it's any good or not, and I can say with pretty much zero qualification that it is. It's excellent. And yes, excellent. I refuse to go for the obvious pun. But there's more to it than this just being a good Dizzy game. There's a lot of cool and new things that Wonderful Dizzy does to make the game more than just a fun nostalgia trip that's not going to have much appeal outside of hardcore Earth appreciators. Fresh approaches to things that the game did in the past that make it a bit more approachable, even to those people who might not have all that much love for Dizzy. For yes, such people certainly do exist. So let's have a look at Dizzy's new adventure in a bit of detail and see how it manages to roll its way into the 2020s as much more than just a fond reminder of past games. Let's have a look at one of the more notable things first, the graphics. Wonderful Dizzy is, well, it's pretty colourful, isn't it? In fact, it's colourful to a point where it actually feels a fair bit removed from a lot of the other Dizzy games. The artists really went to town on it, and some people have remarked that these graphics don't actually make the game feel a lot like traditional Dizzy. It certainly is different, in a way that's a lot closer to how people approach specky graphics today. One of the specky's more famous, or I suppose infamous, features is colour clash. When different colours touch on the specky, they'll kind of weirdly merge and blend with each other. Back in the commercial days of the system, so to speak, this was seen more like an issue, something to try and avoid, whether you did it with big black lines around the sprites, or just by limiting the amount of colour to use. These days, artists on the system see it as something to work with, that can create neat effects and so on, almost like a computerised watercolour. Wonderful Dizzy is still a 1:8K Spectrum game, and it still has to work with the same 16 colours every other specky game has. But the turning of things like colour clash into something that can be actually used makes the game feel quite vibrant, certainly more than Dizzy games were back in the 80s and 90s. All of this is even referenced in the dialogue at the start, in one of many meta moments. See how Dizzy's boots change colour depending on where he's walking. It's magic. Speaking of dialogue, that's another big addition. Wonderful Dizzy has lots more dialogue than any other Dizzy game, which is probably something you should have expected. Beyond cute references to computer history or other Dizzy games, and giving the egg plenty more character than he's had previously, the increased dialogue also puts this far closer to a proper adventure game than previous titles, and as such it has quite the effect on gameplay. Old Dizzy games didn't have too much in the way of chatter. Most characters you met were basically one and done. You come across them, you get a puzzle from them, you solve it, usually by bringing an item to them, and that's pretty much it. Less so here. From the beginning, you're subtly conditioned into talking to people a lot more because they're going to have more than one thing for you to do, or they've possibly got a hint that can help you elsewhere, or hell, it's just nice talking to them. Tinker, who guards a bridge, is a good preparation for that. When you first meet her, you need to have an item in order to pass her and go to the next area. So, you find it, you give the item to her, and then you pass. Simple, right? Now, in most other Dizzy games, that would be the end of your interaction with this character. You would never have any reason to talk to her again. But then, when you go back to cross the bridge, you actually have to do it all again. You have to get another item, which is quite a surprise. And there's a lot more to be done with her afterwards. Little things like this slowly get you into talking more. If you get stuck, and you most certainly will, it's very much worth going around and chatting, because that may well help you find the solution to whatever puzzle's troubling you. You know, just like a good point-and-click adventure game. It's a very nice merge. And, well, what about those puzzles? They're quite traditionally Dizzy, of course. They're still item-based. It wouldn't be Dizzy if you had bottomless pockets for items either, so you're still going to have to do plenty of item management, finding a nice little spot where you're going to be able to put items down and, ideally, not forget about them. The laser focus on items can play some rather neat tricks on your mind. You can get so focused on game logic that you ignore stuff that's obvious. Now, I really don't want to spoil too much of the game's detail, but I'll give one example that I loved. An empty bucket is one of the items, and inside the mountain section of the game's world on one of the screens, you can see droplets of water coming down from the ceiling. Naturally, you can't get to it immediately. Dizzy logic, adventure game logic I suppose, makes you think that obviously you have to get to this leak in order to fill this bucket. That's just the way things work after all. Or do they? Is there not something else you might have missed that's a bit more obvious, almost like it's hidden in plain sight? Little mind tricks like this are quite fun, and it's not just me who tends to get stuck on them. When I've seen other people play Wonderful Dizzy on Twitch, they seem to get entranced by droplets of water that are inaccessible, so presumably you need to find some dynamite or a pickaxe or whatever to get through the rocks that are in the way. Naturally, we've got collecting to do as well. Those coins dotted throughout the game's world are obviously there for a reason, because this is a Dizzy game, and collecting a set amount of these, or crystals, or diamonds, or whatever, is a core game mechanic. Doing such things tends to lengthen the game by quite a bit, especially when you have to find the last few. And Wonderful Dizzy is pretty meaty for a Dizzy game. It's not as long as Fantastic Dizzy, but even once you have the game in your bones and know everything you need to do, a complete playthrough is still going to take you about an hour and a half, and my first playthrough probably took about 3 to 4 times that. How much of that time was spent being completely and totally stuck with no clue whatsoever what to do? Not a particularly offensive amount of time, really. There isn't too much in the way of moon logic, and the world doesn't get old too quickly. Still, there is a risk that this length can amplify one of the potential things that I often think makes people really bounce off of Dizzy games: death by attrition. Attrition can be the biggest challenge in Dizzy games. There's plenty of enemies about, and even if they don't usually kill you instantly, they can chip away at you, especially when you're stuck. And Dizzy traditionally has no way of defending himself of attacking. Lives are pretty finite too, as are ways of getting more or even of refilling your health. There's always the odd very nasty bit too that is always going to be difficult, and even when you know exactly what to do, it can easily nick a life if you're not paying any attention. The crocodile and the dragon in Fantasy World Dizzy, the shark and the lilies in Magic Land, that sort of thing. Even the tunnels in Fantastic Dizzy. This sort of thing can, perhaps understandably, annoy people. However, much like Fantastic Dizzy, Wonderful Dizzy does play a lot fairer with this. Both games are long, but there's plenty of fruit dotted around. Technically, health is still a limited resource, as this food doesn't respawn once you've used it, but it certainly makes the attrition feel a lot fairer. There are parts of this game where you may well lose a chunk of life if you make a mistake, and you may well even have to start from scratch a couple of times. But Dizzy is certainly a bit more equipped for the challenge of this game than he ever was before. Now, these are just a few things about the new Dizzy game that I really enjoy. Obviously, I could go into other things like the game's plot, based as it is around the wonderful Wizard of Oz and all that, but that's something you should experience for yourself. I do think that it's not only one of the best Dizzy games, certainly right up there with Fantastic Dizzy, but it's actually also one of the most accessible Dizzy games too, which is great to see from a series that's so old and coming back for what, as I said before, could have just been a nostalgia tour that pays no attention whatsoever to anything that's changed about game design in the 25 plus years since this egg was last around. Wonderful Dizzy is absolutely not that. I do think that even if you've never liked any of the Dizzy games that you've previously played, you should still give this one a go. It fixes a lot of issues that people may have previously had with the games, while still keeping everything that makes Dizzy what it is, and the result is a brilliant revival that I really hope brings us more Dizzy games like this in the future. The Oliver Twins have certainly done a great job, and any coverage of the game is naturally going to focus heavily on them, but don't forget about the less famous but also important Eastern European team, largely, of relatively newer Specky coders and artists too. They've all come together to make this game as good as it is. And hey, with the strange nature of things lately, why shouldn't we have Dizzy not just be good, but also relevant? Bye for now. Thanks very much for watching. If you liked the video, please do like it, leave your comments, subscribe and all that other good YouTube stuff. Have a look at my social media, my Twitter, my Twitch, because I'm live quite a lot. And also, if you really like my stuff, maybe you'd like to have a look at my Patreon. You could join this list of awesome people here who I would very much like to thank. Alexa Jones-Gonzalez, Andrew Dalton, Arcade LY Webmaster, Brian Henniger, Chris, D. Xalior Rimwan Sutter, Dagorath Dungeon Keeper, Danny Wolfers, David Matuszek, David Rose, Dinty76538, Douglas Miller, Dustin Cooper, Gary Samaden, Glunfith, J.S. Manchild, James Brown, Jace Alexander, Jeff Ladd, Johnny, Kid Cassette, Lucas Kaligovsky, Mike Clayton Travis, Martin Pataki, Nate Milbank, Piotr Margel, Ren Bimon, Robert DeFelice, Rod B, Rusty Kelly, Sam Stoddart, Seth A. Robinson, Simon Gulliver, Stuart Christopher Brownlee, Tammuz, Tariq Amir, Tim Wald, Tom Kay, Yerka Operator, and to all the rest of the community, thank you very much, and goodbye.